we start, as you said, with the first paragraph and the first sentence and the first word, which is God. And as you rightly said, the kind of all of life and thought and our salvation centers around God. But I guess a question that you begin to address in the introduction to the article is, it gets to the rest of that first paragraph of the Catechism, which is, who is the God that the Catechism introduces? What does the Catechism and Catholic theology tell us he's like?
Yeah, so it's you're adverting to perhaps a surprising thing that we pivot to. We start with God, and then we begin to say immediately, God doesn't need us. He's infinitely perfect and blessed in himself, as the Catechism itself says. There is no absence in God. He is not lonely. He is not alone. He's not solitary. He exists in triune Trinitarian bliss. He's pure act. There's no potency, unrealized capacity within God. There's certainly no disordered privations within God. And yet, we and many other things exist. Creatures exist. And so that leads us to the next question, or the next observation. If God doesn't need creatures, anything other than God, he has no need of such things, yet there are things other than God, and many other things other than God. So why is that? And that emphasizes the fact that God's goodness, not God's need, God's goodness, an overflowing of the divine goodness, is what is the principle from which God freely chose to create all of created reality. And then, because of original sin and disorders which came, his divine goodness is also the reason why he freely chose to redeem humanity. So we start with God, and we see in God, with the Catechism, the divine goodness, nothing absent, lacking in God himself. And as infinitely good, God freely chose to create. He did not have to. And so we are here, we exist, and we stand in real relation, real dependence upon God, because he's a good God. And so that also is like another step in our journey to uncover the meaning of Catholic theology. We start with God, but then immediately we're struck with the truth. This God is a good God. He's a loving God. He's a gracious God. This is the God that theologians, and all Christian faithful for that matter, seek to understand and to know and to love.
Yeah. The line, infinitely perfect and blessed in himself, as you rightly said, kind of rules out any kind of lack, privation, defect, imperfection, but also freely creates out of his own goodness, right? So it's a good God we're dealing with. But I thought it was also very interesting. You acknowledged that, and the Catechism paragraph does as well, that there's also a kind of closeness or presence of this God to the human creature that he creates, to the whole of his creation.
Yes, that's a profound point. So, Gideon, you're ever the systematic thinker. So yes, we start with God. Theology begins and ends with God. Christian life begins and ends with God. All of life, all of reality begins and ends with God. And we see that this God is a good God, and good is self-diffusive. Goodness shares itself, and God freely created. And now we arrive at a third step, which says God didn't just freely create as if like he came up and says, you know what, creatures, here. Never say, I didn't give you anything, and I'll see you later, do well with what I have given you. No. The nature of creatureliness is such that God, basically creatures can never, ever, ever exist completely independent of divine causality, of divine sustenance, in the sense of that God holding us in being. We know from the Bible, in him we live and move and have our being. And so what we also render precise at the beginning of the article is the fact that God is not a distant and is not an absent God. He's not a watchmaker that wound us up and sent us out and says, I hope you do okay. He is a God at every moment, from the lowest subatomic particles of our physical existence to the first principles of our spiritual existence, all the way up to our most highest thoughts, operations, actions. God for all creatures is present, holding them in being, sustaining them in existence. And so God's goodness is not something extrinsic to us, distant from us. It's a goodness most proximate and immanent to us. And so what this does for those thinking about Catholic life and Catholic thought, it recalibrates everything to realize, oh my goodness, as a Catholic theologian or a student of Catholic theology, everything that I encounter in my day-to-day experience is ordered according to the divine goodness, divine wisdom. But it's not just like a blueprint that inspired the way things exist, but God's present causal, his causality, his causal goodness is still present each and every one of us. And so that inspires all rational creatures who engage in the work of understanding truth to reflect upon the fact that nothing can ultimately be considered fully or adequately without being considered in relation to God. And so that's what we set up in this opening part of the article. There's nothing in all of reality which is not fodder for Catholic theology, because God is the subject of Catholic theology and God is present to all things, and therefore all things can be considered in reference to him and in light of his own revealed truth.